In January 2016, John Scott received a phone call that was designed to destroy him. On the other end was a high-ranking NHL executive with a single question. Do you really think this is something your kids would be proud of? He wasn't asking about a suspension. He wasn't asking about a dirty hit. He was asking about John Scott going to the All-Star Game, an event he was voted into by the fans. See, the NHL had a problem. The internet decided to turn their showcase event into a joke by voting in a 6'8", 260-pound enforcer with 5 goals in 285 career games, a guy with more penalty minutes than points, a guy whose entire job was to punch people in the face and terrify anyone who touched his teammates. And the league was humiliated, so they tried to bury him. They orchestrated a trade to get him off a roster. They banished him to the minor leagues in Newfoundland. They called his manhood into question and attacked his family. But here's the thing about trying to break a man who fights for a living. It usually doesn't work. So was John Scott just a meme that went too far? Or was his prime actually the most beautiful, satisfying disaster the NHL has ever seen? John Scott was never supposed to make the NHL. He grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, a kid who was always the biggest guy on the ice but never the most talented. He wasn't a blue-chip prospect, he wasn't on anyone's radar. After a decent junior career, not a single NHL team wanted him. He went undrafted, so Scott did what every overlooked player does. He went to college, he played 4 years at Michigan Tech, grinding it out in the middle of nowhere, Upper Michigan. And even there, he wasn't a star, he was just big, like really big. But that size, that's what got him a shot. At 6'8" and 260 pounds, Scott was a physical freak. The problem was he could barely skate backward. His hands were average. His shot was forgettable. By every traditional measure, John Scott was not an NHL caliber hockey player, but traditional measures don't account for fear. See, in the mid-2000s, the NHL still had a role for guys like Scott. They called them enforcers, goons, heavyweights. Their job wasn't to score goals or create plays. Their job was to protect the stars and punish anyone who touched them. They were human shields. And John Scott? He was the most terrifying shield in the league. When he stepped on the ice, the temperature changed. Opposing players kept their heads up. Cheap shots disappeared. Nobody wanted to answer the bell against a guy who looked like he could fold you in half. But here's the thing about being an enforcer. You're respected in the locker room and mocked by everyone else. The highlights people remember? Louis Eriksson laid out unconscious from a Scott hit that earned him a suspension. Phil Kessel literally skating away from a fight because he wanted no part of it. To the media, John Scott wasn't a hockey player. He was a punchline, a relic, the definition of a plug. And for 8 years, he accepted that. Until 2016, when the internet decided to make him the most famous player in the sport. It started as a joke. In December 2015, a writer from the blog Puck Daddy floated an idea on a podcast. What if we voted John Scott into the All-Star Game? Not because he deserved it, but because it would be hilarious. The internet heard the call. Reddit exploded. Twitter exploded. Hockey fans who had never voted for anything in their lives suddenly exploded. The whole idea had a simple pitch. The All-Star Game is a meaningless exhibition anyway, so why not make it entertaining? Why not send a 6'8" enforcer to skate alongside Sidney Crosby and Patrick Kane? Within weeks, John Scott was leading the fan vote, and it wasn't even close. The NHL panicked. This wasn't supposed to happen. The All-Star Game was their marquee event, a showcase for the sport's biggest stars, a weekend designed to attract casual fans and sell the league's most marketable faces. And now the face of the event was a career goon who averaged 6 minutes of ice time per night. League executives made phone calls. The reporters now started writing papers urging him to quit. They quietly suggested that Scott should do the right thing and bow out gracefully. He refused, so the NHL went nuclear. On January 15th, 2016, just 2 weeks before the All-Star Game, the Arizona Coyotes traded John Scott to the Montreal Canadiens. On paper, it looked like a routine depth move. In reality, it was an attempt to stop this. Montreal had no intention of playing John Scott. The moment the trade was complete, they buried him in the American Hockey League. Not in a nearby affiliate, not somewhere convenient. They sent him to St. John's, Newfoundland, a frozen rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, as far from the NHL as you can possibly get while still being in the organization. The message was clear: you're not welcome here, go away. And that's when the phone call came. A senior NHL executive, a guy whose name Scott has never publicly revealed, called him directly, and instead of congratulating him on being voted in by the fans, he tried to shame him out of attending. Do you really think this is something your kids would be proud of? Let that genuinely sink in. A league executive questioned his parenting, questioned his dignity, tried to convince a man that showing up to an event he was democratically elected to would somehow embarrass his children. Scott had every reason to quit. He was stuck in the minors. His wife was pregnant with twin girls. The entire hockey establishment wanted him gone. Nobody would have blamed him for walking away. But John Scott didn't become an NHL enforcer by backing down from a fight. He told the executive he was going to Nashville. He told the Canadiens he would see them there. And he told the media exactly what the league tried to do to him. The story went viral. Suddenly, Suddenly, this wasn't just a joke anymore. It was a complete war. The faceless corporate machine versus the blue-collar grinder who refused to be erased. And the fans? They picked their side. January 31st, 2016, Nashville, Tennessee. John Scott hadn't played an NHL game in weeks. He'd been rotting in the minors, separated from his pregnant wife, waiting for a league that despised him to let him have his moment. And then he stepped onto the ice at Bridgestone Arena. The crowd went wild. 20,000 fans rose to their feet. When John Scott's name was announced, the building shook. It was the loudest ovation of the entire weekend, and everyone in that arena knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't just cheering, this was a message. But here's the thing nobody expected. John Scott actually showed up to play. The All-Star Game is a glorified scrimmage. No hitting, no defense, just vibes and trick plays. Most players coast through it, protecting their bodies for games that actually matter. Scott didn't get that memo, in a good way. First period, the puck cycles down low, and somehow, John Scott finds himself alone in the slot. The pass comes. He doesn't think. He just shoots. The bench erupts. His teammates mob him like he just won the Stanley Cup. Scott skates to center ice with his arms raised, a grin plastered across his face, soaking in a moment that no one, not the league, not the executives, not the scouts who passed on him, ever thought was possible. But he wasn't done. Later in the game, Scott gets the puck in the neutral zone, and instead of dumping it in like an enforcer is supposed to, he does something absurd. He skates. He carries the puck through traffic. He walks in on a breakaway. The goalie doesn't stand a chance. Scott rips at top shelf again and scores his second goal of the night. The building explodes. His teammates are laughing. The announcers are in disbelief. The fans are chanting his name. And somewhere in a luxury suite, an NHL executive is watching his nightmare unfold in real time. John Scott wasn't just surviving the All-Star Game, he was dominating it. By the end of the tournament, the Pacific Division had won, and when it came time to vote for the most valuable player, the league faced a decision. They could give it to a legitimate star, someone with endorsement deals and highlight reels, someone who belonged there, or they could do the right thing. The fans made the choice for them. Write-in votes flooded in. It wasn't close. John Scott was named the 2016 NHL All-Star Game MVP. When they handed him the keys to a new Honda and the team a check for $1 million, his teammates didn't just congratulate him, they lifted him onto their shoulders. A 260-pound man hoisted into the air like a championship trophy, and the executive who questioned whether his kids would be proud, he had to stand there and watch. 2 months after the All-Star Game, John Scott played his final NHL game. In April, Montreal called him up for one night, a single appearance against the Florida Panthers. He logged 9 minutes of ice time, threw a few hits, and that was it. He never played in the NHL again. Some people called it a farewell, others called it a pity appearance. But John Scott, he called it exactly what it was, a mic drop. He didn't need to prove anything else. He'd already done the impossible. He'd turned a joke into a movement, an insult into a coronation, and a weekend in Nashville into the most talked about moment of the entire NHL season. And the league? They made sure it would never happen again. Within months, the NHL changed the All-Star voting rules. They implemented safeguards. They gave themselves veto power over fan selections. They restructured the entire format to prevent another John Scott situation. Think about that. The NHL literally rewrote their constitution because of one man. A guy with 5 career goals forced a billion-dollar organization to change its rules. They call it the John Scott rule, and it's still in effect today. But here's what the league never understood. They thought John Scott was the problem. They thought the fans were mocking the event. They thought the whole thing was an embarrassment to the sport. They were wrong. The 2016 All-Star Game was the most watched in years. It generated more media coverage than any showcase event in recent memory. For one weekend, people who didn't care about hockey were talking about hockey. He reminded people why they fell in love with sports in the first place. Not the corporate polish, not the manufactured storylines, but the idea that sometimes the underdog actually wins. That the guy who was never supposed to be there can become the biggest star in the room. After his retirement, Scott wrote an essay for the Players Tribune. In it, he talked about the phone call, the trade, the exile, all of it. He didn't name names, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew who tried to break him. And the message he left behind was simple. He stood up for himself when powerful people told him to sit down, and he won. That's the legacy. Not the goals, not the trophy, not even the $1 million check the team got. It's the fact that John Scott proved something that most people forget. The worst player in the NHL is still one of the best hockey players on the planet. A guy who was mocked for his entire career still made it further than 99.9% of people who ever laced up skates. There are Hall of Famers with 500 goals who will be forgotten in 20 years. Names that casual fans will struggle to remember. Careers that blend together in the endless highlight reels of hockey history. But John Scott, he will be remembered forever. Not because he was the most talented, not because he had the longest career, but because when the NHL tried to erase him, he refused to disappear. He entered that weekend as a joke, but he left as a legend.